Hey everybody, this is vandweller, and the title of this video is Flying Blinds, Real-Time Small Blind Shove Decisions on the Sit-and-Go Bubble. This is my first video for Deuces Cracked, and I wanted to do a classroom-style video to start off with, because I think that the video is going to set up a lot of the core concepts that my thinking about sit-and-goes revolves around. So for subsequent videos, I'm going to sort of be calling back to things that I talked about in this video. So I thought it was important to get sort of some of this stuff out of the way, and subsequent videos are going to be, you know, kind of playing videos and also analyzing students' hands and so forth. But again, I thought it was important to start off with a classroom video just to sort of get the fundamentals out of the way of how I think about sit-and-goes. So the topic of this particular video is how to make decisions in real time on the sit-and-go bubble when you're in the small blind. You know, you're sitting there, the small blind is folded to you, it's the bubble, and you have to make a decision. Do I shove on the big blind or not? And that is basically the topic of this video. Now, I want to start off with a few comments about Sit-and-Go Wizard and other, ICM tools like Sit-and-Go Endgame Trainer and Sit-and-Go Power Tools and so forth. I'm going to be talking about Sit-and-Go Wizard, although the comments are applicable to all those games. Now, good players do spend a lot of time going over their games in Sit-and-Go Wizard. That's why they're good. They play a session and they bring up all the hands that they were questionable about, and they look at them, and that is an important part of your development as a sit-and-go player. However, many players, in my opinion, students and other players I've talked to, use what is, in my opinion, a very ineffective and time-wasting study method. And their review sessions, their post-game review sessions, consist of bringing up a series of trouble hands in Sit-and-Go Wizard. The red X's, you bring up all the hands for your game, and all the red X's come out, and those are your mistakes. So they bring up all those trouble hands from their sessions, and they make sort of a cursory and vague evaluation of each hand. So they look at a hand and it says to fold, but they pushed, and they kind of look at it, and they sort of nod their head and say, okay, I won't do that next time, I'll remember. And then they move on to the next one and do the same thing. It says push, and they folded. They go, okay, I'll remember that, and they want to sort of get through that as quickly as possible. And players who do this, their hope is that by seeing enough situations, flashed in front of their eyes, that the correct plays over time are going to sort of cement themselves into their minds. They're sort of passively permeate the membranes of their brain and sort of just go in there, just sort of passively, without their active involvement. And so they hope that over time, by seeing enough situations, that they'll have that their push-fold sense, if you want to call it that, will gradually become honed, and over time they'll make fewer and fewer mistakes, because they will have seen so many situations, and they won't make those mistakes again. Now, if you ask such a player, a player who follows this study method, why such and such a hand is a shove or a fold, he will be unlikely to really give you any specific reason other than just, well, I know it by experience. You just got to play a lot, and you'll just sort of get to know. And he might be able to give you some sort of vague, well, I've got a big sack and he's short, and I should be able to get him to fold, and so forth. But mostly it's going to revolve around, well, you just got to get playing time in and see enough hands, and you'll know. The fact is, however, that learning effectively is an active process and not a passive one. And this is true in really any field, not just sit-and-goes or poker, but, medicine, economics, or welding. You have to go out and actively get knowledge of the world. You have to ask questions, run calculations, consider things, do research. you can't wait passively for knowledge to imprint itself on your mind. I mean, imagine if someone studied medicine that way. You know, you just open the medicine textbook, and then you just kind of run pages through your eyes without really processing much. Well, you wouldn't really want to be treated by a doctor who learned, quote, learned medicine that way. And also, learning requires focus, which requires slowness. So, that quick kind of cursory glance and sort of vague head nodding or head shaking that most people are satisfied with when they review their games, it's not an active process. They don't, players who do this don't allow for any, clear identification of any facts or factors. And so they really don't form any generalizations or principles that might help them in other similar but different situations, right? All they learn is, they hope to memorize, this specific hand with this specific stack setup, and they sort of hope that by running enough of these through their mind that sort of they'll just, every single possible situation that they'll ever run into will pass through their mind and pass over their eyes, and that they'll be able to push fold that way. But they're not actually, learning anything. They're not coming up with any principles that will guide their play in the future when they come up across any unknown situations. Now, this is not to say that players don't improve this way. Many do, and I would tend to say that most people who do improve through that method are going to be somewhat gifted people, who just have an aptitude for learning in that way. But for most of us who are not geniuses, and now I know that this isn't this audience, everybody in this audience is a genius, but let's just imagine that some non-geniuses might watch this video. For most of us that are not geniuses, the going is going to be painfully slow and uncertain. You ask sort of a player who's sort of a beginner intermediate player, hey, how's your ICM? And they go, well, I think I'm doing all right. I mean, I'm sort of winning. I've played 700 games, and I kind of seem to know what I'm doing, I think. And chances are you are one of these players, and you go back and forth between live play and sit and go wizard or sit and go power tools, hoping that one day, by seeing enough situations, that sort of like one day that a mental switch is just going to automatically flip on, and you'll finally get it. You'll understand push fold, and then from that point on, you'll just be an unstoppable sit and go machine. I say that there's very little chance of that happening. I mean, the mind just doesn't work that way. So to attempt to grasp push fold by just feeling or sense or that sort of vague gaze of the eyes over situations without any analysis is ultimately ineffective. I mean, if you find yourself in a spot, you're in the small blind, it's folded to you, and you push or not, and if you find yourself in a spot that you haven't really seen before, and your push fold sense or your feel isn't really prepared for it, you essentially have no guidance. And the reason I called this video, or not this video, but this section of the video, the curse of Sit and Go Wizard, is because Sit and Go Wizard and all these other ICM tools, they are tools that are so impressive and powerful that they give us the illusion that by merely using them, by merely opening them up and running situations across our eyes, and I've got all the stacks set up here, and I'm playing around with the fold equity, and I'm really learning. I mean, these tools are so powerful that they give us the illusion that merely by opening them up and playing around, that we're helping ourselves, even if in reality we aren't. And for many players, running through these programs and just passing situations in front of their eyes passively, it's a huge time sink. And worse, it can convince us that we are making progress, when all we might actually be doing is making ourselves feel proactive. Someone says, how are you running? Well, I'm running pretty bad, but I look at all my hands in Sit and Go Wizard, so it's not my fault. I'm doing okay. So it makes players feel better to think that they're doing something for themselves, even if nothing in reality is actually being accomplished. Now, the reason that this vague kind of glazing over of the eyes and staring passively at situations over and over and over again, sort of that, flashcard way of learning. The reason that doesn't work, that sort of vague grasp, is because there's nothing vague in reality about whether or not a given hand is a push or a fold, right? There are specific factors that give rise to the answer, right? Forget about theories or any kind of strategies you've learned based on big blinds and so when to push and so forth. In the actual situation, you're sitting there in the small blind. There's a guy to your left. He has a stack of a certain size. He's going to fold a certain amount, and of course you have a certain amount of equity in the tournament, and you have a certain hand with a definite hand strength and so forth. So all that situation is external to you, right? And there's nothing vague in that situation. Everything is what it is, and it's all specific. So to attempt to, went a little forward there, to attempt to grasp these specific factors by a sort of vague kind of passive method is ultimately ineffective. And so what I want to do is I want to actually, instead of just glazing over the various factors, glossing over the various factors. I guess a gloss is the same as a glaze in a lot of ways. Instead of glossing over the particular factors of the push-fold decision, I want to identify them explicitly so that we can then go on and try to make good decisions, based on actual factors that exist, sort of external to our minds. And so when we're making the push-fold decision, basically we're trying to figure out if we should be making an all-in bet or not, right? And an all-in bet has 4 basic aspects that determine its value. And those aspects are as follows. How much showdown value does my hand have? What do I stand to gain by making the move? How much am I risking to gain it? And how often will I get away with it? Now, these are the components of any EV calculation for, an all-in bet anyway. And the sit-and-go version of this is the ICM calculation. Now, that's sort of a loose way of talking. ICM really only measures your tournament equity. But, in a loose way of talking, we can say that the ICM calculation is basically the all-in bet EV calculation of sit-and-goes. In subsequent videos, I'll explain the difference. But so anyway, the basic actual mathematical formula for an all-in bet is displayed on your screen. Now, I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to explain it. So basically, it says that the expected value for an all-in bet that you make, and this is for a cash game, tournament, whatever, is the following. A certain percentage of the time, your opponent is going to fold, right? And when he does, you're going to win the pre-flop pot, right? And a certain percentage of the time, he's going to call. And when he calls, you're going to get into this following situation where either you're going to win, and when you do win, you're going to win the amount of your stack, or the effective stack, because that's what we're going to win. Whoever's shorter is, the amount of the stack that we're going to win. Because either if we're short, we're going to double up, or if the other guy's short, we're going to win his stack. So we're going to win the amount of the effective stack plus any dead money. And sometimes we're going to lose, and when we lose, we're going to lose the amount of our stack, or, the effective stack. Now, these 4 questions, right? The first question, they're pretty easy, right? How much showdown value does my hand have? That obviously refers to how often we're going to win the pot when we're called. And if you notice the green parts in the formula, that's the showdown value. Your hand strength is that green part. The question, what do I stand to gain, right? It translates to what we're trying to win. And most obviously, what are we trying to win when we shove? We're trying to win, the blinds and antes, the pre-flop pot. But also a component of that is winning the chips in our opponent's stack, if we happen to get called and show down a winner. And what you stand to gain, and this is really important, what you stand to gain can actually be measured or estimated by your stack size. And that may seem a little counterintuitive or puzzling. But winning the blinds means more to a shorter stack and less to a larger stack, right? So say that you have 3 blinds, and the blinds in the amount of the pre-flop pot in the middle is 1.5 blinds. Well, winning those 1.5 blinds is going to mean more to a shorter stack than it is to a larger stack. It's a larger percentage increase to gain those 1.5 with a 3 blind stack than if you had, say, a 10 blind stack where it's not as big of an increase. So what you really are attempting to win or what you're attempting to gain is the percentage increase in your stack. And I apologize for the typo there. What you're attempting to win is the percentage increase in your stack, and the shorter your stack, the more the blinds will help, will increase your stack. So that's why we can measure reward, in this sort of risk-reward idea, we can measure reward as in terms of how big our stack is. So if you see here, the components for the for the reward in the equation are represented by the green. So when we fold, we win the pot, and if we call and we win, or if we get called and we win the amount of our stack plus any dead money. So the third factor, how much am I risking? And at first glance, this seems to be very easy. What am I risking? I'm shoving all in. I'm shoving my stack in, so obviously I'm risking my stack. But sit and goes are tournaments, and well, I hope you know that. I hope I didn't have to state that. If you don't know that, then there are probably some more elementary videos that you should be watching. Sit and goes are tournaments, and chips don't equate dollar for dollar with money. As you know, if you have any experience in sit and goes, that each additional chip you gain or add into your stack is worth less than the chips that you already had in your stack to begin with. So there's sort of a marginal decreasing utility for chips, if you know that phraseology from economics. And so we're not really risking our stack so much as we're risking what our stack represents, and what our stack represents is our equity in the tournament. And in my experience, it is this factor that most students and other players I've talked to have the vaguest grasp of. And we're going to discuss how to estimate our tournament equity later in the video. But just for time being, I want to show you that this aspect of the risk is captured in this part of the equation. When we lose, the times that we lose, we're going to lose the amount of our stack. And then the question, how often will I get away with it? I hope this one is obvious because it's the only one left and it makes sense. Refers to fold equity, how often our opponents will fold and call, and those are represented in the equation in the parts that are green: fold percentage and call percentage. So the point of my showing you this is not to give you sort of an exhaustive presentation of these 4 topics, but just to show you that there is no factor that I indicated that is ambiguous or vague, and none of them are irrelevant. So if you ignore or undervalue or overvalue any one of these factors, you're going to be doing so at the expense of the quality of your decision making, and therefore ultimately of your long-term results, right? So we while we know that these 4 factors, right, if you plug everything into this equation, we know that you'll get the right answer every time, right? If you could do this every time it's folded to you, and you could run this equation, you would never make a mistake. But of course, doing so for any given push-fold decision would be a bit too complicated. Now, I want to point out too, just so I don't leave this hanging, is that this formula here, is sort of a cash formula where it assumes that where it says stack here is the same as stack here, and of course in a tournament that isn't true. So we sort of have to translate each of these elements of the equation into something that takes into account the fact that when you win when you win an amount that represents a smaller gain than the loss is when you lose it. But I mean, that's just, hopefully you already understand that, given that you have experience playing sit and goes and studying them. So it's here that we have a problem. So we know that the passive approach to learning and applying push-fold decisions doesn't work, or at least I've asserted that it doesn't, and I hope you can see that is the case, or at least that there's some better way to do it. So we know that the passive approach doesn't work, or at least is somewhat ineffective, and it leaves us without any real-time guidance when we're actually trying to make real decisions in a sit and go. But we also know that while the ICM calculation, and plugging ICM values into that EV formula, that would give us the right answer every single time. But in practice, there's no way to do such a calculation, on the fly during the heat of battle, right? Unless you want to time out all the time or use, software that most players will find ethically questionable. So do you see the problem? The passive approach, the passive vague approach doesn't work, and the active specific approach is totally impracticable. So, but the problem is, if we want to keep playing sit and goes, we need to learn to and apply push-fold knowledge and make accurate judgments in real time, right? So what we need is some sort of method to help us approximate the answer to push-fold problems in real time, but something that's more accurate and grounded in reality than just, that vague, push-fold feel sense that people want to acquire. But it has to be something that's actually achievable during gameplay, which is totally relentless, and one table pops up and then another one does, and you've got to make a decision. So we need something that is more realistic and more grounded in reality than just sort of that vague feel, but something that we can actually do. So and that's the point at which I went to work, because I wanted to sort of just get a sense. And of course, I didn't have any video in mind when I was doing this. I was just sort of doing it for my own edification. So, this is sort of how I spend a lot of my free time, which is maybe a little sad, but we are what we are. So I wanted to see if I could sort of come up with a better way, a good way to sort of approximate those 4 factors in real time, such that I could, make a decent, or come up with a system to sort of make decent, or at least a framework to make decent push-fold decisions on the fly. So the first thing I did was I used Sit and Go Wizard, and if you don't have Sit and Go Wizard or any other ICM tool, then you absolutely have to get Sit and Go Wizard if you want to continue playing Sit and Goes. It's, in my opinion, it's absolutely essential. All the best players are using some form of ICM software, and if you aren't, then you're going to be sort of behind the 8 ball. And Sit and Go Wizard, in my opinion, is the best one and probably the most powerful. So what I did is I opened up Sit and Go Wizard, and Sit and Go Wizard has a quiz feature where you can set up a kind of scenario and then run through a lot of setups, a lot of situations. And so what I did is I did that. I ran through a lot of situations, and I made sure to go slowly, and I attempted to evaluate each of the 4 factors, separately and individually, just sort of in a qualitative way. And there was nothing really, specific about it. I just wanted to say, all right, in this hand, I have a pretty strong hand, and I probably don't, and I don't have a lot of fold equity, and my tournament equity is pretty high, and so forth. So I didn't really, make any numerical attempts. So if you remember what those 4 factors were, they were hand strength, stack size, tournament equity, and fold equity. So after several dozen quiz hands, I started ranking each factor on a scale of 1 to 10. And the reason that I did this is, I would look at a hand, and I would figure out, okay, the hand strength is strong, and stack size is low, and then by the time I got to the 3rd or 4th one, I would forget how I rated the first 2, and then I would have to go back. So I started to write this down, and just sort of, casually, just so I would remember it, I had started assigning, values on a scale of 1 to 10 to each of these, with, the number 10 indicating the factor was strongly indicative of a shove, and that a 1 strongly indicated a fold. So 3 of these factors were pretty easy to quantify. Fold equity, in the Sit and Go Wiz quiz, fold equity is just right out in front of you, in an actual number. Hand strength was pretty easy to quantify. If you have If you have pocket tens, you have a strong hand. If you have 2-3 offsuit, you have a weak hand. Stack size again was easy. If you got 10 blinds, you have a big stack. So the blinds don't help you as much, and that sort of indicates a fold. If you have a small stack size, then the blinds help you a lot more, and that indicates a shove. And the fourth one, tournament equity, was much more difficult to pin down, and I'm going to get into how I finally tackled that later. So over the course of several hundred of these quiz hands, and it might have been over 1,000, because I'm a little slow in the uptake, I noticed a pattern. And what the pattern was, I just started, I looked at these numbers, right? And, so I would, write down this was a 9, this is an 8, a 3, and a 2. And, you see a column of numbers, and you kind of naturally start to just add it, or at least I do. And so I noticed a pattern, right? If the scores of the 4 factors totaled 22 out of 40 or higher, the correct move was almost invariably a shove. And if they totaled lower, it was almost always a fold. And this was a total shock, because here I was just sort of casually ranking these things, and all of a sudden, like 95% of the time or so, if they totaled 22 or over, it was a shove, and less than that was a fold. So, that you can see how that's kind of shocking, for it to be so accurate like that. So what I did is I actually, I figured, well, maybe I'm onto something here. So I actually made a chart and, putting all the information, sort of organizing it, how I ranked each factor and so forth. And I started to refine the way that I scored each factor over, the course of hundreds of, or maybe over 1,000 hands. And I just sort of did this by trial and error. I didn't run any sophisticated, mathematics at all, or any software or anything like that, because I'm just really not good enough at math to do such a thing. So I'm hoping to get better at math. Maybe I wouldn't have to do this kind of thing. So I made this chart, and the chart is now refined enough such that with the quiz difficulty, because you can set different difficulties, with the quiz difficulty set on average, it will predict the correct move around 95% of the time. Now I want to say though, I don't consider this chart, complete, and it's not like the definitive chart for all time, and I'm putting it out there and standing behind it 100%. It's pretty neat, but there are some revisions that could be made and some additions, and I'm totally aware of that. But I don't really have any plans or an active, timetable, to say when the chart is going to be complete. So I know I'm going to get a PM or an email and said, you done with the chart yet? Are you done with the chart? I'm not done with the chart. I don't know when I'll be done with it, or if I'll even be done with it. All it is just, some ideas I have sort of put into chart form. So anyway, without further ado, I present to you the chart, and there's the chart. And don't worry, it's actually easier than it looks, and it actually works. But obviously you're not going to be able to read the chart like that on this video, and I'm going to want you to be able to use the chart during the video. So I want you to do in the this video's thread on the Deuces Cracked forums, there's going to be a link where you can download this chart in like PDF format, and I may make it available in like Word format so you can edit it or whatever you want to do. And there will be a link to that on the videos thread in the Deuces Cracked forums. And one other thing I would like to request, I can't make you do it, but I would really prefer that you do not distribute this chart to anyone outside of the Deuces Cracked membership without my permission. Like, don't go to 2+2 and say, hey, look at this great chart, and just post it. Because I may wish to use this chart, in a book or an article or in some other way, and I'd sort of like it to be a surprise when I do it. So if you could just please not throw this chart up on BitTorrent or post it in 2+2 or Pocket Fives or whatever, I would really appreciate it. So anyway, what we're going to do now is actually learn briefly, or not so briefly, how to use the chart and to see how it works. So the first thing we do on the chart is we find our hand strength. And what we're going to do is we're going to, here's the chart here. Now I'm not going to keep, moving the chart over the video because obviously you won't be able to read what's behind it. So I can't keep doing that. So really, if we get at this point, just make sure you've downloaded the chart and you have it sort of on the side while we go along. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to find our hand strength on this chart and then assign a point value to it. So for example, this first one, 8 for offsuit, is right here. Our hand is at 8 or a 9 high, and it's important. This isn't like totally rigorous, and I haven't listed every single hand. 6-3 offsuit, do this. 10-2 offsuit, do this. Queen 6, do this. Just find the hand that is closest to its category on the chart, and you'll be okay. I mean, this chart is about estimating, not about being absolutely rigid. So anyway, 8 high on this chart scores 3 points. And we have King 6 here, offsuit, and that's King rag, and that would be 6 points. So I want you to do, the other thing to do is also on the chart, we're going to assign it a point value. But if your 5 high through Jack high hand, in between here is a suited connector, I want you to add a point. So for example, if it were 7-6 suited, 7-6 is normally 2 points. But it's a suited connector, so just add a point and make it 3 points. Okay, that's because that increases the value of the hand, and therefore that's more of a shove indicator. So we want to add points, right? Okay. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to just kind of run through these hands. Write it down on a piece of paper really quickly, and score your hand according to the standards of the chart. And then after that, I will show you the answer. So those are the answers, and I'm not going to really take any time to explain the answers because I think the hand column on this chart is pretty straightforward. So if your answers don't match mine, then you're going to want to go ahead and just kind of pause the video and take a look at what you might have done wrong, and then continue along. So now the second thing that we're going to want to do when using the chart is score our stack size. And now you're almost never going to have an exactly even number of blinds or a stack size that ends in 0, 0. So just choose the closest stack to yours. And if your stack size falls almost exactly in the middle of 2 big blinds, in your stack size in the middle of 2 of them, then tend to round your stack size up. And that means take the option with the lower score. And make sure that you're using effective stack sizes after posting. After you post the blind, the amount that is actually in your stack as opposed to what you've already put in the blind. So, and I also want you to take sort of special note of some of the uneven stack size rows in the big blind. There's one here, 10, 9. You'd expect it to go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. But it doesn't exactly work that way. I mean, because I consider this chart to be more of a discovery than an invention. And so it's not really up to me how the numbers shake out. And it just so happened that it sort of worked better this way. My early incarnations of the chart, I had 10, 9, 8, 8, 7, 6. And, I just sort of considered this one sort of a high 8 and this one sort of a high 7 or low 8 or whatever. But just come as close as you possibly can and round up if you're over one of them. And also take note of the one here that's 3.5. So if you happen to have 3.25 blinds, then just assume you have 3.5. Time to round up. If you have 4.5 blinds, pretend you have 5 and score at 7 points. So, and remember to use effective stack sizes. So we'll do one together, and this is pretty straightforward. So the first one here. We have, what do we have? 7.5 blinds. So, in looking on the chart, 7.5, it's above that, so it's probably here, and we're going to score it 4 points. So what I want you to do is, this one is pretty straightforward. So what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the video and score your big blinds, assign your stack size a score, and then come back and I'll show you the answers. All right, so those are the answers. And again, I'm not going to go over it because I think this one is pretty straightforward. The only thing to look out for is this one here and this one here where you have the other guy covered. Make sure you're using effective stacks and not and not your actual stack. So the third thing that we want to do when we're using the chart is estimate and score our tournament equity. And this is probably the most difficult and unfamiliar of the four factors. Now, everybody who's watching this video knows that you have a certain amount of tournament equity, right? I mean, you open up Sit and Go Wizard, it says you have equity of 22% or whatever, and okay, but we don't tend to look at that number, except when you open Sit and Go Wizard, there's the equity of push and equity of fold, and we don't really think about where that number comes from. And the only way we consider it is to see, well, if our equity of push is higher than the equity of fold, then we're going to push. And then we can see how far apart they are to see how clear of a push it is and so forth. But we don't really tend to think about where those numbers come from, right? But that's actually very important because, oops, I don't want to give it away. That's actually a very important thing because remember, it's a risk-reward scenario, right? And what we have at risk is our equity. So, that's really something we have to think about is how much we're actually risking. Otherwise, how do you know if you're on the right side of the risk-reward equation? So it is the most difficult and unfamiliar of the four factors for many students, for many of my students. And it's actually the one that when they learn it, I think they actually end up with the most improvement in their play. And I want to assure you, though, that even though it's a very difficult thing to get a handle on, I want to say that eventually estimating and scoring your tournament equity will become second nature. And in time, you will actually be able to closely estimate, often with 1 or 2%, within 1 or 2%, and even less, your actual tournament equity in seconds. You'll be able to look at a setup, take a moment to look at it, and you'll say, oh, okay, I've got about 17% equity. Right? Now, that is a really powerful thing to be able to do because if you know exactly how much you're risking and you can sort of approximate what your stack will look like after you do it, then you can almost, run the risk reward right in your head and know exactly how strong a hand you need to shove. So it's an actually very powerful thing to be able to do, and I can do it. On the bubble, you show me 4 stack sizes and I can come within a percent or two of knowing what your actual tournament equity is. And so your tournament equity is, if you know anything about ICM, if you know how to calculate it, you know that ICM values your stack by assigning a certain percentage chance that you finish in each place in the tournament, and then it also multiplies your chance of each place of finishing in each place by the value of each place, right? So as it turns out, your tournament equity is overwhelmingly determined by your standing in the tournament. And what I mean by your standing in the tournament is very simply whether you're in first place or second or third or fourth. And it doesn't really have so much to do with your stack size in isolation. If you say, well, I've got 5 blinds, or I'll talk to a student and he'll say, well, I've got 12 blinds, so I was pretty healthy. I was in good shape. Well, that has nothing to do with it. What really determines if you're in good shape or not is how your stack relates to the other stacks in the tournament. And if you're the person who's most likely to finish in first, then obviously you can see that you are going to have a lot of equity. If you're the person who's if you're most likely going to finish in fourth, you're probably not going to have a lot of equity. So what we do to use the chart is we're going to evaluate our standing in the tournament, or we're going to evaluate the standing of the shortest stack if we have the big blind covered, right? Do you understand why we do that? When we're trying to figure out our tournament equity at risk, right? We want to find out how much we're risking, not how much we actually have. Now, you can obviously use this method to determine how much you have, but really in the context of determining whether to push or shove, it's really the tournament equity that we have at risk, and that means that of the shortest stack. So obviously, if we're on the bubble, there's 4 people, and we're obviously going to be in first, second, third, or fourth place, right? And then what we do is we're going to determine how close or far we are from the next highest and lowest player, and this is going to determine our base score. So for example, say that we're in third place in the tournament, and we're pretty close to second place. Maybe there's like a 500 chip difference. Then our basic score would be a 5. Okay. And then what we do is we sort of modify our score up and down a point or two, depending on how other stack standing devalues or adds value to our equity. So, for example, if being close in chips to our next highest opponent is generally going to what? It's going to decrease our score, right? Because we have more equity. Being close, if you're close to your next highest opponent, that's sort of an equity boost, and that means it decreases our score because when we have more equity, right, we have more risk, and therefore that's less of a shove indicator, right? When you're risking more, that means you are less justified in risking it, and therefore that is going to be more indicative of a fold than a shove. You get that? And of course, if the next lowest player to you is close to you, this is going to increase your score by a point because you have less equity, right? He's closer to you, and that tends to devalue your equity, which increases your score, right? Less equity means you have less at risk and you're more justified in risking it. Now, if you have the big blind covered, and this is really important, if you happen to have the big blind covered in chips, you want to generally add a point to your score if he's relatively near you in chips, and add 2 points if he is far away from you in chips. And the reason that you do this is, why would you do that? Why would it make a difference? Well, the reason is, if you have a big blind covered and his losing his amount of chips means more to him than it does to you if you were to lose his amount of chips, right? If he loses his amount of chips, he loses a certain amount. But since if you lose the hand, you're going to have chips left over, right? So losing his amount of chips means more to him than it does to you losing the same amount of chips. So what's that going to do? That means the amount of equity that we assign to the guy who's covered, well, that number is going to actually be less for us than it is for him. And that means that's less equity, right, at risk, and therefore that means a higher score, right? Less equity at risk means you're more justified in risking it, right? So I hope you understand that. If you don't, ask me in the forums thread. And just a couple other things. If you are in second place and the third place player is fairly close to you, add a point, right? If he's close to you, that means you have less equity, so you're going to add a point, which means more of a shove indicator. And if he's nearly tied, then you want to add 2 points. And that's it's just sort of little mini adjustments. If he's more than a double up away from you, then subtract a point. That means you have more equity, therefore it's less of a shove indicator. And if he's totally screwed, if he's got like less than his starting stack and he's nowhere near the rest of the players, then go ahead and subtract 2 points. And that's if you're in second place specifically. So we're going to go through examples and show you, how all this works. So if you haven't followed it up to this point, I think it will become evident in the examples. So here's one other thing that sort of just happened, and this was really an accident and a total coincidence, right? Now, I haven't gotten to the call part of the chart yet, but just know that there is a call percentage. That's basically your fold equity, how often he calls. Now, amazingly and totally coincidentally, the score of your equity will usually indicate a tournament. Now, it'll be easier in examples. The score of your equity will usually indicate a tournament equity percentage, which is nearly the same percentage as the fold equity percentage that has that same score. And that sounds, almost like a legal document. But what I mean is, let's say that we're in fourth place, right? And in this chart, let's say we're in fourth place, and if we doubled up, we would be in second place. So that's a score of 8, right? As it turns out, if you read the chart across to the call percentage column, a score of 8 indicates 17%. What actually ended up happening, and I made a few tweaks once I discovered it was pretty close. You will actually have around that percentage equity in the tournament. So if you're in fourth place, and by doubling up you would be in second place, then you're going to have about 17% equity in the tournament. You know, it might be within 1 or 2 points, right? If you are in third place and you're close to second place in chips, then you're going to have a score of 5, and a 5 means 25% equity in the tournament. Now, that is, in my opinion, pretty amazing, because that sets it up where we can actually have. I mean, if you just memorize, you know, sort of how this works, which isn't really hard in the long run, you can actually look at the setup and know almost exactly how much tournament equity you have at that very moment. And so this sets us up for some observations, right? If you have less than 25% of the chips in play, your equity will never be lower than the percentage of chips you have. So as long as you have under 25%, say you have 15%, right? If you have 15% of the chips, you will never have less than 15% equity in the tournament. And by implication, if you have more than 25% of the chips, you will never have less than 25% of the equity in the tournament, no matter how the other chip stacks are distributed. So even if there's a guy with a monster stack and a guy with, like 5 chips left, if you have 25% of the chips, you will never have less than 25% equity in the tournament. So that means your equity is always going to score a 5 or less, right? So I think that's an interesting thing. And so it's actually a good idea to memorize the number of chips that represents 25% for your particular site's structure. Now in full tilt, that 25% of the chips is 3375. So if you have 3375, you have at least 25% equity in the tournament, and maybe more, but you're never going to have lower than that. 10% is also a useful number. On a full tilt, that's 1,350 chips. So if you have 10% of the chips, on the bubble, you'll never have less than a tournament equity of 10%. You can, whatever ones you find useful, 20%, 15%, you can sort of work that out, how many chips that would represent, and, I find that to be very useful. So because this is a pretty complicated thing and pretty unfamiliar, I want to do a few of these together, and then I will give you some to work on your own. But we're going to run through about 8 of them together so you really get a sense of how this works. So for this first one here, now get out your chart so we can sort of do this together. If you are in this one, we are in what place? We're in 4th place, right? And if we doubled our stack, that would put us in 1st place, right? So if we look on the chart, 4th place can double into 1st. That means we score a 7, and our equity is going to be roughly 20%. Now let's see if, all right, good, because it's been a few weeks since I actually looked at this slide, so I'm glad everything's sort of working out. So our next one is we are in 4th place, and if we doubled up, we'd have 3,400 chips, and that wouldn't even be, we'd still be in 4th place. So if you look on the chart, find the 4th place, and if we doubled up, it says can't double into 3rd, and so our score would be a 10, and we'd have about 12% equity in the tournament. So let's see if that's right. Did that work? Hey, that worked. So let's look at the next one. So if we look here, we are in, what place are we in? We are in 3rd place, right? And we are far from 2nd. I wouldn't say far from 2nd, but we're sort of equidistant from 2nd and 4th. And so on the chart, this says 3rd place far from 2nd, but the fact that a guy is kind of close to us also devalues our equity a little bit and makes that a score of a 6. Which, does that say 6? Very good. And so the next one here is, now we are actually in 3rd place, but remember, we have to look at the effective stack, and we are shoving on a guy that is smaller than us, right? So we have to, since the whole point of calculating our equity is to find out what we're risking, right? We're only risking, this amount. So what we do is we, as we indicated, evaluate his tournament equity, right? So where is he at? He is in 4th place, and if he doubled up, he wouldn't even be in 3rd place. So that would score a 10. But remember, we have him covered, and when you have a guy covered, his equity means more to him than it does to you, and you're losing less equity than him. So what you have to do is adjust by adding points, right? Because when you add points, that means that the more points, the less equity at risk, right? And the less equity at risk, the more justified you are in risking it. So what we're going to do is, he has a base score of 10, right? Fourth place cannot double into third. But since we have him covered, and we have him covered by about 2.5 times, which is very good, we're going to add 2 points to the score and make that a 12. If you had an 11, that's okay too, but I would say it's more of a 12, right? So that's how much we're risking. Let's go on and do a few more, just so you can sort of get the idea. So in this one, we have the larger stack, so we have a guy covered, right? So we have to evaluate his tournament equity, and then adjust it up or down, or up a couple points if necessary, in terms of finding our score. So he is in fourth place, and if he doubled up, he would be in second, right? So if we look on the chart, fourth place can double into second place. That gives him a base score of 8, but we have him covered. It's not a huge margin, so it's probably not a 2-point adjustment. It's probably a 1-point adjustment, and we'll adjust that up 1 point. So 8 plus 1 is 9, and we get a 9. And so our next one here, we are not covering him, so we're going to evaluate ours. We are in second place, but we are far from first, right? So our base score, second place far from first, is a 4. And let's look at the other stacks. The other stacks are pretty darn close to us, right? I mean, they're within just a few hundred chips, and they're sort of both up there. So that's going to tend to, what? Devalue our equity, right? So that means we're going to add a point. So the base score is a 4. We add a point to adjust for our devalued equity, and that makes that a 5. And of course, a 5 is going to be about 25% equity, which, I mean, it's really cool that you're able to do that. Even if you forget, this chart, just the ability to be able to do that, translate these stack arrangements into your actual tournament equity, or pretty darn close to it, is worth worth going through the hour-and-a-half video that this is going to be, in my opinion. So we're going to do 2 more here. This one, we are in second place. We are close to first place, right? So our base score is a 3, but this stack here is close to us. So that's going to tend to what? That's going to tend to devalue our equity, and that means we're going to add a point. And so for a 3 plus 1 is a 4, and that ends up being a 4. And the last one that we're going to do together here, we are in fourth place, right? And if we doubled up, we would be in first. So our base score, see, is right here. Fourth place can double to first. Our base score is going to be a 7. But if you notice that we're really close to these other guys, right? So that's going to tend to increase our equity, which means what? Which means we have more equity at risk, and therefore less justified in risking it, and that means a lower score, right? So that's going to increase, that's going to probably subtract a point and give us a score of 6, and it does. And I'm glad all that worked out, because again, I haven't seen these in a couple of weeks. So anyway, what we're going to do now is I'm going to pause the video again, and there are 4 here that I want you to try to do on your own. And when we come back, after you unpause the video, I will give you the answers. So here are the answers, and 10, 7, 11, and 6. And I will go over these really briefly because I think this is such an important thing to do, and it is fairly involved. So here we are in fourth place. If we doubled up, we wouldn't even be, what would we be in? We would be, we can't even double into third place. So that would be a base score of a 10. And in fact, if you wanted to give it an 11, you could, because here's this thing where it says you can't double into third, and you have 2/3 of your starting stack. So we have just about 2/3 of our starting stack, which would be 1,500. And so, you know, you're probably closer to 9% equity than to 12% equity. So either way, a 10 or 11, again, we're not trying to come up with an exact thing. This is just an estimation to sort of, you know, evaluate in general terms where you are. The next one, you are in fourth place, and if you doubled up, you would be just in first place. So fourth place can double to first. That's a score of a 7. That one's pretty easy. This one here, we have the other guy covered, so we have to evaluate it from his perspective. So he is in 4th place, and if he doubles, he would be in 3rd. But we have him covered by a good 2-to-1 margin, well, almost 2-to-1 margin, and so that's going to, so his base score is going to be a 9, right? 4th place can double to 3rd, but we're going to add a point or two to adjust for the fact that his equity, we don't lose as much equity as he does when we lose it. So if you wanted to give that a 10 or an 11, I would accept either one. And then this last one here, we are in 3rd place, and if we doubled up, we would be in 2nd, right? So 3rd place, double up in 2nd, and how far are we from 2nd? We're fairly close with a 5 there, but close to 2nd. I mean, we're not super close. We're not super far. We do have a good lead on this guy. If you wanted to give it a 5 or a 6, I wouldn't quarrel with either one of them, but I just think you're going to end up closer to a 6 here. So anyway, the last thing that we do, and this is going to be much easier, is to score your fold equity. And now when you're using the quiz feature on Sit and Go Wizard, the call percentage is right in front of you, right? I mean, it just says what it is. So, I mean, that's not too troublesome. Now, of course, in real life games, much of the art of Sit and Goes is in estimating, your opponent's calling and shoving ranges. And unfortunately, this is one aspect where you will have to have some experience, and that experience is going to play a large part. And as you get more experience, you'll be able to do it better. However, you can use logic and observation to get a general idea of what your opponent is capable of. I mean, you can put yourself in your opponent's place and ask yourself what you would call with. And if you think he's worse than you, then you can, sort of adjust for that. If you think he's better than you, then, I never think anyone's better than me, so I don't know how to do it that way. But now, if your opponent is a thinking player, his ranges will be much easier to read. And when he has a lot of equity at risk, he will tend to fold, right? And this is why understanding equity can help you understand, help you put yourself in your opponent's shoes, right? When he has a lot of equity at risk, right, he's less justified in risking it, and therefore he'll tend to fold. When he has very little equity in his stack, he doesn't have a lot at risk, and he's more justified in risking it, and he'll tend to call. So knowing when your opponent is going to be protective of his equity, or how protective of his equity he's going to be, is going to be an important factor for your estimating how much fold equity you have. And now, of course, if he's an unthinking or an inexperienced player, I find that they tend to call a little bit more than their situation requires, although that's not an absolute rule, and you will find some inexperienced players who don't call as often. But I think that's true more in the minority of cases. And in real-time play, you can actually use very quickly combinatorial hand reading techniques to estimate your opponent's call percentage. And this topic could be a whole video on its own, and I am sure that there's some video on Deuce's Crack. I haven't gone through the whole catalog yet. I mean, I just started. So you can actually use combinatorial hand reading techniques to estimate your opponent's call percentage. And I'm going to go over this briefly. This is not an exhaustive presentation of this. I mean, the video is almost an hour already. So what you can do, though, is if you can sort of think about what range of hands he will call you with, you can translate that very quickly into a percentage, right? So for example, now what you do is for every pocket pair in your opponent's range, right, you want to count 4.5, and I don't even count 4.5. I count 0.5% because it's just easier. It's going to be you're going to come close enough. So for every pocket pair, give him 0.5%, half a percent. And for every unpaired hand, and that means suited and non-suited included together. So ace-king would be ace-king suited and ace-king offsuit. Count 1.2%. Right? So for example, say that you think your opponent is going to call you with any ace, any pair, or any Broadway cards, right? So there are you already know how many pairs there are. There are 13, right? So if you multiply 13 times half a percent, you get 6.5%. Really? That's just multiplying 13 by 5 and then moving the decimal place over, right? So you get about 6.5%. That's not exact, but it's close enough for quick estimation. And you know that there are 12 unpaired aces, right? Because there's ace-king down through ace-2, and that's 12 of them. And you know that that's true just quickly because there are 13 different cards, and unpaired means ace doesn't go with ace. So ace goes with the other 12, right? So 12 times 1.2, you know what that is because you know how to multiply by 12, right? 12 times 1.2 is basically 12 times 12, and you move the decimal place over. So that's 14.4. And then, I mean, this last one will take sort of some experience and just kind of, if you do it over and over again, you'll understand how to do it. So, I'd recommend that you sort of take various hand ranges and try to quickly estimate what percentage of hands they represent. So, but there are basically 6 remaining unpaired non-ace Broadway hands, right? And so 6 times 1.2 is 7.2. So you add all these three things up. 6.5 for the pairs, 14.4 for the unpaired aces, and 7.2 for the Broadway cards gives you a number of 28.2%, which, if that's what you estimated his range was, you could look at it right on the chart and say, all right, I'm going to score that a 3. So that's not a shove indicator. So anyway, when you're using the chart, that was just a quick, brief method of how you can sort of quickly assign a percentage to just a list of what you think he'll call with. And over time, if you keep doing that, then you will be able to do that fairly quickly. And I can do that fairly quickly just from experience. And what you can actually do is make a quiz for yourself. Or if you want, I'll actually make a quiz and I'll post it in the thread here for the video. Just to problems for you to work out. So anyway, when you're using the chart, tend to round up to the nearest listed percentage unless you are within 1% of the percentage. So say that you have 24% call, right? As that's what it says on the Sit and Go Wizard quiz. Then pretend you have 25%, and that would be a 5, right? If you're at 18%, then that's probably close enough to a 17% where you can count it as an 8. If you're at 21%, it could go either way. It's not that huge a deal. We're just trying to get, sort of close. So, and also be aware there's an issue that you might have more or less fold equity than it might initially appear, depending on the actual calling range that you are up against, and whether any of the cards in your hand block a good portion of the cards in your opponent's range. So say you're shoving with an ace, and you think that a good portion of your opponent's range consists of hands with aces in them. Well, he's obviously going to be much less apt to call you since there's one fewer ace for him to have, so you're going to have more fold equity. So what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the video, and this is going to be really straightforward. And we're just going to score your fold equity according to the chart. And the first one here, obviously, it says 15.8%. We're going to round that up to 17%, and that means down a point to 8 points. So go ahead and pause the video, write these down real quick, and then we'll come back and I will show the answers. So there are the answers, and I'm not going to go over those because I think this part is pretty straightforward. So that's it. That's how you score each of the 4 factors according to this chart. And what do we do next? Well, we're going to add up the scores for all 4 factors. And as we said, if they total 22 or greater, your hand is almost always going to be a shove. And if they total 21 points or less, your hand is almost always a fold. And so there's some sort of observations that I've made based on this, right? And this, sort of applies to real-time decisions. In most cases, in order to shove, you are going to need 2 factors to be very indicative of a shove, 8 to 10 points, right? But by themselves, those 2 factors aren't going to be enough. So the other factors have to point, at least in some small way, to a shove as well. And this is sort of what I teach my students when we're going through push-fold decisions. I have them sort of give me, an evaluation of each of the 4 factors, not on like this rigid 1 through 10 scale, but just saying I have a lot of fold equity and I have a very strong hand and the risk reward is okay, right? So the first 2 factors are overwhelmingly indicative of a shove, and the other 2 indicate a shove to a small extent. So anyway, that being said, if you do happen to have 2 very strong shove indicators, it's going to be a shove in the overwhelming majority of cases. And I would say this, that most real-time push-fold mistakes that I see arise from totally failing to consider 1 or more factors, as opposed to misevaluating a factor. It's much more common for someone to totally, ignore how much tournament equity they have at risk, for example, right? Or their fold equity, or how much the reward is, right? Rather than, what they do is they ignore that, rather than consciously thinking about all four factors but happening to miscalculate one. It's much more common, the first scenario. So now what we're going to do is we're going to show just a few examples of the chart in action. And what I'm going to do is open up Sit and Go Wizard quiz feature, and I'm going to run through a few hands just to give you a sense of how it works and to show you that it in fact does work. And now, as I said, the chart tends to score, I think the average is about 96%. Now I've scored as low as 90% and as high as 100% when I'm using the chart, rigidly without my, assistance. When I just run through the chart and, whatever it says I do, and I don't help it. It seems to average out about 96%. You might say, well, 96%, that's not perfect. Well, I know for a fact that a lot of my students are scoring, when they come to me, they're scoring in the high 60s, in the 70s, and some of them in the low 80s. So if you're not scoring 96%, then this chart is better than you. And I think there's something that you can learn from it. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. Let me open up Sit and Go Wizard. And I want to show you the parameters that I set up for the quiz so that you can do this on your own and to see how the chart works. I use the full tilt structure because that's the site I was playing on primarily when I formulated this thing, and that is one of the kind of faults of the chart, is that it does it in big blinds and not in terms of it doesn't account for antes. But you can adjust this chart to account for antes, and if you're not quite sure how to do that, I can show you how to do that in the forums if you ask me. So anyway, I set it up on full tilt because there are no antes. Difficulty average. You can set it on expert. I didn't do that, and the reason I didn't do that is because I wasn't looking, when I initially created this thing, to get every single nitpicky decision correct. What I wanted to do was see how to capture the broad strokes, just how the factors interplayed with one another in sort of your everyday average typical scenario. I will say that it does tend to work on the expert level decisions somewhere between 82 and 86%, which is actually very good because, these are expert level decisions and this is a rote chart. I will say this, though, that expert decisions on in Sit and Go, the expert level decisions in this quiz, are usually ones that are within small, fractions of a percent in terms of the difference between folding and shoving. And one thing I always say to my students is don't sweat the close decisions, because the closer the decision, the less it matters what you actually do, right? And what it really matters is how you get the big decisions. And as long as you're doing okay when the tough decisions come around, then you're going to be fine. So anyway, I have it set on average. I have minimum number of players 4, maximum of 4. I just sort of arbitrarily set what these blinds were. Hero position, small blind. We're trying to decide whether to push or fold. And then, maximum hero stack 3 blinds, minimum hero stack 3 blinds, maximum 11. And then these other minimum opponent stack 3, maximum 25, and so forth. So if you want to follow along, these are the settings to use. And so let me go ahead and bring up a quiz and see how we do. So here's the quiz. And, it's very possible. As I said, this chart isn't perfect, and, I'm kind of flying blind here. So it's very possible I could get 2 or 3 wrong, or I could get them all right. And, I believe in the chart. I've, used it over several thousand hands now, and that 96% accuracy, I'm pretty well convinced of that. So if I happen to run bad and get 2 or 3 wrong, don't hold it against the chart. Just know that it's variance, and variance can happen in life too. But I just hope it doesn't happen right now. So anyway, here's our scenario, and what I actually have to sort of assist me to do this is just this little thing I made in Excel or OpenOffice, which is what I use because I'm a cheapskate. And and it's very simple. It just helps me keep track of the scores that I assigned each of the factors, and then it adds them up and totals them right there. So you can make this sort of thing on your own. If you're totally Excel, incapable of doing anything Excel, sort of like I am, then I will actually put a link to this where you can download this little calculator in the thread on the forum for this video. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. And I can't keep bringing the chart over because it's going to cover everything. So just make sure you have your chart by your side. So I did the first one here, but here I'll change it all back to 0. That way it's a big surprise. The first one, our hand, right? It's 7 high. So if you see, that actually rates a 2 on the chart. Our stack is about 4 blinds. So that's going to rate an 8. Our equity is, we are in, what's our equity situation? Well, we are in 4th place, and if we doubled up, we would actually be in 3rd place. So that's going to rate a 9. And our call percentage, how often are we getting called? We're getting called 49.5%, which, as you see, is pretty much 50%, which rates at 0. So this is going to say to fold, and hopefully this isn't one of the ones that gets wrong, but we'll do it, and it was right. So that's nice. I'm glad that worked. So let's see the second one. I'm not sure quite how many I'll go through. I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10. I don't want this video to go too long, but right after this, I'll be wrapping up, so it's not going to be that much longer. Our hand is 10 high, so that's a 4. Our stack is what? We have 4.5 blinds basically, so that's going to give us about 5 blinds rounding up, and that's going to give us 7 points. Our equity, we are in last place, and if we doubled up, we would be in 3rd place, just barely, but that still counts. So that's a 9, and he's calling 52.5% of the time, which is around a 0 or a -1. That still says to fold. So let's see if we go ahead and fold. And I got that one right. Now, I know a lot of people would, you know, if we go back to that, I mean, I know a lot of people would just shove that, right? No matter what. But I mean, it depends on how loose the guy's calling. That's what really is the deciding factor here. So you just can't automatically say, well, I've got less than 5 blinds, I shove, right? No, you can't do that. There's 4 factors, not just your stack size and not just your equity and so forth. So anyway, let's go on to the next one. Where are we here? Okay, so let's see. Our hand is King 10 suited, which rates a 9. Our stack is just under 10 blinds, so we'll call that 10 blinds, and that scores a 1. Our equity is, well, we are in 3rd place. We are close to 3rd. I'm sorry, close to 2nd, and far away from, there's one guy who's he's almost screwed. So our base score is going to be a 5, and our equity score is going to be a 4. And I have a suspicion that this is going to be one of the ones that it gets wrong, but we'll see. It's hard to say. Because again, I mean, I've worked with this for so many hands, but I do know that it has some flaws, and I'll explain a little bit why those flaws come about in a little bit. And call percentage 26% is going to be about a 4, and this says to fold. Is it a fold? It actually is a fold. So look at that. I'm worrying about nothing. But again, I know people who would just insta shove that. Oh, it's King 10 suited, under 10 blinds, blah blah blah. No, can't do that. Hand, all right, here's another one. Our hand is 9-8 offsuit, which is 9 high, which scores 3 points. Our stack is, let's see, these are the tough ones when it's 240. I hate these. So 7, it's about 7 blinds, so that rates a 5. Our equity is we are in 4th place, and if we doubled, we would be in 3rd place. So we're going to call that a 9. And call percentage is 33%, so we'll round that up to 35 on the chart, score that 2, and this is a fold. Even though, you know, if you're looking at it, even though we've got, you know, less than, even though we're the short stack and we've got less than 10 blinds, this is still a fold. Again, there's 4 factors that that really, you know, affect your decision. So you can't just say, I got under 10 blinds, I'm the shortest stack, bam. No, there's still, you know, room where you've got to fold. You know, and I know a lot of people are getting these kind of decisions wrong. You've got to take into account how often he'll call you. If he's very loose, you can't do it. So let's do another one. Queen 7. Where's my thing? There it is. Queen 7. Queen high is a 5. Our stack is like 3.5 blinds or so. Is that about right? Yeah, we'll call it 3.5. So that gives us a 9. Our equity in the tournament is we are in 4th place, and if we doubled up, we just barely be in 3rd, so that's a 9. And he's calling a 70%, which is -2. And this is a borderline one. 21. Sometimes 21s end up being shoves, but we're going to follow the chart, and that we got that one wrong. Well, so again, there are kinks in the chart. It's just that he was calling so much, but again, I'm not worried about it. I believe in the chart. So we'll do a couple more now that I'm totally deflated. Our hand is 10-6 suited, so that's a 4. Our stack is, of course, this is the same kind of thing. It's probably going to get this one wrong too. I always run bad. Our stack is about 4.5 blinds, so we'll call that 5 blinds, which is a 7. Our equity, we are in 4th place, and if we doubled up, we wouldn't even be in 3rd place, so that's going to be 10. And call percentage is 66, which is still a -2, and that says to fold. And well, we got that one right. So, and just a couple more. Our hand is jack high, so that's a 5. Our stack is 11 blinds, so we're just going to rate that a 1. Of course, actually, wait a minute, we got the guy covered, right? So we've got to remember that. So it's really 7 blinds, which rates a 5. Our equity, remember we got to count his equity, right? So he is in 3rd place, and if he doubled up, he'd be in 1st place, right? Well, actually, we don't do that. He's in 3rd place, and he's sort of equidistant between, the next highest guy and the guy below him. So we're going to give him a 6, and his call percentage is 14%. So we give that a 9, and that's going to be a push. And is it a push? It is a push. So, and we'll just do this last one. Our hand is 8 high, so that's a 3. Our stack is 11 blinds, so we'll just call that 10 because it doesn't really go above that. We'll give that 1. Our equity is, what are we? We are in 4th place, and if we doubled up, we'd be in 2nd, right? So that makes us an 8. And his call percentage is 22%, which makes that a 6, so that scores 18. And even though, we're in last place, we're desperate, we're way behind, it's still going to be a fold. You want another one? This one's going to be pretty easy, though. So our hand is ace-6 suited, which is an 8, or 9, sorry. Our stack is 10 blinds, so that's a 1. Oh, come on. Hold on. Sorry about that. 9, 1. Our equity, we are in 4th place, and if we doubled up, we'd be in 2nd, right? So that's an 8. And the call percentage is 15%, which is closer to 14 than to 17. So we'll call that a 9. And that, obviously, there's nobody in the world who wouldn't push that, I don't think. So, but that says to push. Anyway, that is just some of it in action. As I said, it tends to run around 96%. And if you're not doing as well on the quiz on those settings as 96%, then it's probably in your interest to go ahead and work with this chart a little bit. So now that we've learned how to use the chart, seen it in action, now what? Well, one thing I would do is I would take this chart and I would use it just like we did in the Sit and Go Wizard quiz mode for several hundred hands if you can stand it. Hopefully, if you have a high tolerance for boredom, you'll be able to do this. And being sit and go players, you really should have a high tolerance for boredom or you're on the wrong business. But doing this is going to help you automatize the scores you give to various factors, in your own mind. Eventually it'll come to the point where you'll say, I'm in 2nd place, and if I double, I'm in 4th place, and if I doubled up, I'd be in 2nd, so that's 8 points. I'm in 3rd place, close to 2nd, but there's a guy right behind me, so that's 6. You'll eventually be able to do that really, really fast. So that's one way to use the chart. And then what I would do is sometimes use the chart and sometimes don't, right? And what you want to do, but still use that means in the quiz mode. So sometimes don't use the chart when you're going through the quiz mode, but use the method of the chart. And this is going to help you to become less reliant on the actual chart and help you to further automatize the thought process behind it. And I would actually have a copy beside me when I play, sort of just as a backup, especially if you're not like a massive multi-tabler. Now you won't have the fold equity number on the screen, so what I would do is I would first score the other 3 factors and get a sense of their severity, and then evaluate your fold equity and whether it points strongly enough to a push or a fold to sort of tip the scales, or whether it's even relevant. I mean, you might have 2 overwhelming factors and the other one's okay, and that might not matter what your fold equity is. So have a copy beside you when you play. And then I would use the chart when reviewing your actual mistakes in Sit and Go Wizard to sort of diagnose where your thinking went wrong. You look at your mistakes and you say, boy, I must have I sort of overvalued my standing in the tournament. I thought I had too much more equity than I actually did, or I thought he had this amount of fold equity, but he had that amount, or or so forth. And then what I would do is just go back and use the chart in the Sit and Go Wizard quiz every so often to tune up your game. Now, and the other thing you can do is alter the chart to fit your own discoveries or suit your own needs. I mean, this chart isn't set in stone. I've already said that there are some flaws, and it's made by a human being, and not from Zeus. So, if you decide that you like a certain, because one thing I haven't really done is aces and kings and queens don't really rate a 10. They're going to be like a 13 or a 14 or something like that. I mean, in essence, this is a 1 through 10 scale, but I had to sort of add these things above it to account for certain extremes. So, alter the chart. There's nothing wrong with that. I'll put up a Word document of the chart in addition to the PDF, so you can, do it yourself. The other thing is, say you want a bubble chart from the button. What to shove from the button. Now, this won't really work for that, but if you can figure out a way to sort of use this as a base, now that you know how to evaluate your equity and so forth, you could make your own one from the button. So, alter the chart. Now, when I use this chart, when I teach students, I don't necessarily teach them, the chart in its specifics, but what I do have them do is, evaluate each one of these things, each one of these factors in a qualitative way. So I say, well, how strong is your hand? Is it overwhelmingly indicative of a shove? And they'll say, yeah, I have pocket nines. And I'll say, okay, what about your stack size? Is it overwhelmingly indicative? And they say, yeah, it's about 3.5 blinds. And I'll say, what about your equity? He's like, well, I got a certain amount of equity, and so forth. I don't necessarily say, well, what are the point values? Because that's really not ultimately the point. So that leads me into some final thoughts here about the chart. I am fully aware that this chart has limited, and as I've tried to indicate several times, I don't consider this, to be perfect, unimprovable, or complete, or like the definitive chart for all time. It has limitations. For one thing, it's still cumbersome to use in real-time play. I mean, if you actually sat there with this chart and try to work out every bubble decision from the small blind, it would still be a little bit cumbersome, especially if you're multi-tabling. But of course, the point of it is not to rely on the chart. It's to sort of calibrate your sense of how strong each hand is, how desperate you are to get the blinds, how much equity you have, and how what your fold equity is. It's to sort of calibrate your mind, right? To give you a sense of when you're desperate and when you're not. So even though it's cumbersome to use in real-time play, it's not really fully meant to be used that way anyway. It's really just there to get you in the ballpark mentally. The other thing is, it can also have trouble with certain extremes. If you're short stacked with a very bad hand and bad fold equity, sometimes it can suggest that you fold even when you should push. I could work that into the chart, and I know I could make it more accurate, but that's just there are reasons for that. And the other thing is, I designed it only with enough precision, as I mentioned, to perform well under the average setting in the quiz mode. Under expert, it performs at about 85%. And as I said, most of your decisions are not going to be expert level decisions. And even when they are, as I already said, the closer the decision, the less that it matters what you actually do. If there's a 0.04% difference between shoving and folding, whatever you do, it isn't going to affect your bottom line all that much. This chart is really intended to help you capture the broad strokes, right? Not necessarily the nitpicky expert decisions. That being said, I do believe that I could make it more accurate, even in expert mode, if I made it less granular. You know what I mean by granular? Like if it had, instead of 10 points I had 20 points, or if I assigned half points, right, there would be more kind of hooks, so I could, sort of capture more subtle distinctions in equity or in fold equity or in your stack, or get more specific with regard to how strong your hand is. So if I did that, if I had more way stations or whatever, then I could do that. But of course, then again, it would be much more difficult to use. And as I said, it doesn't work in an unmodified way from the button or from under the gun or whatever nearly as well as from the small blind. But I believe that you could make such a chart, and this chart would be a very good start. And the other thing is, it doesn't really take into account any non-ICM considerations. So while the chart might say to shove, you might very well have a good reason to fold, metagame, or if a guy is, could be starting to look you up light but you're not sure, or if you want to show him that you can fold every so often to increase your fold equity later. This chart isn't really going to have much to do with that. This chart is trying to approximate, the ICM considerations. So non-ICM considerations are really up to you. But to criticize or pick apart the chart or the concepts in the video based on these limitations or other nitpicky reasons is really, I think, to miss the point of the video. Yeah, the chart is cool and surprisingly accurate, right? So that's great. But the point of this whole video is not this particular chart. It's that in order to perform well at push-fold, you have to be willing to think, to take into account all the relevant factors and weigh these factors intelligently. Even if you don't learn the methodology of the chart, down to every single, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 points, and what the distinctions are between each. The mere fact of just asking yourself, what is my hand strength? What is my stack size? So I know what the reward is. What is my equity? So I know what the risk is. How often is he going to call? Just by consciously asking yourself those questions, you are going to arrive at better decisions. So while this chart has limitations, the method it's based on doesn't. If in every shove-fold decision you can accurately weigh, the 4 factors, fold equity, hand strength, stack size, and tournament equity, you would never make a mistake, if you could do that. And while, you'll probably never become an absolutely perfect push-fold machine, and, the only method that is going to get you give you even a fighting chance at becoming such a perfect push-fold machine is not the passive and time-consuming absorption method, but the deliberate and repeated exercise of informed thinking. And that's really the point of this, is that, if I had to sum up the video in a sentence or two, I would say passivity, bad, activity, good, right? Thinking, good, non-thinking, bad. So anyway, that's it for the content part of this. There is going to be sort of a quiz, which is going to give you some more examples of how to use the chart and the methodology of the chart. And what I want you to do is go ahead, if you want to take the quiz, there's going to be 20 questions. So go ahead, basically 20 hands, sort of like a Sit and Go Wizard quiz. Number a piece of paper 1 to 20. And each question is going to ask you to estimate each of the 4 factors using the chart. And write down each rating and whether or not the hand is going to end up a push or a fold. So you write down each rating, total them up. If it's 22 or more, you say push, and if it's less than that, say fold. Now each frame is going to last 5 seconds or 3 seconds or a few seconds. So pause the video during each frame to give yourself enough time to read and answer the questions. And then the answer is going to be given at the end, so make sure to pause the video before the answers appear, if you're not ready for the answers. And when the answer frame appears, pause the video again so you can check your answers. And if some of your answers disagree with mine, go back and watch the relevant part of the video, which I've tried to make it easy for you to find with this little table of contents here with the highlighted, the part of the video that it's on highlights. So anyway, so here comes the quiz. And again, also if you have any questions, or if, you don't get a quiz answer right and don't know why, then you can go ahead and ask me in the forum. So anyway, let's go ahead and start with the quiz. Oops. All right, now let's start. All right, here come the answers, and there they are. So that's it for this video. I appreciate all those of you who slogged through the entire 90 minutes of it. I do think that classroom videos are very helpful in learning sit and goes, maybe even more so than live play videos, but I will have live play videos and in addition to more classroom content. I hope you got something out of it, and please feel free to ask me any questions either by private message or in the forums, in the video thread on the forum. This is vandweller. Thanks for watching.